Welcome everyone. Can you hear me? Can you confirm in the chat that you hear me? Great, okay. We will wait a little moment before we start, before everybody is in. And I also want to recommend to, I think Joost or Angela just mentioned it, but to actually use the direct Zoom link if you can, because we will do the chat, both the chat and the Q&A through the direct Zoom link. It works better than the Woofa chat actually. So for the ones that are still looking or watching through Woofa, I suggest to use the direct link, and you can find it at the bottom of the description. All right, welcome everybody. I hope everybody is in at the moment, or some people might still be joining. I will introduce myself briefly. My name is Erwin Krediet. I'm one of the board members of the Open Foundation. I've been involved since the beginning, actually in 2007 we started. I'm also a psychologist and a researcher at the Leiden University Medical Center, where we are studying psychedelics in combination with psychotherapy for the treatment of PTSD mainly. And well, that's enough about myself. A warm welcome to Matthew Johnson for this first track of the day. Well, I think most of you will know Matt for sure, but he is, I'm just reading something about mute here, but I maybe should actually close the chat because it might be too distracting. I assume everybody is hearing me. So, well, Matthew Johnson is a professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. For the people that don't know him, he has been involved with psychedelic research for a very long time, was part of the psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety trials, did a really interesting study also with psilocybin for smoking addiction treatment. And there's a lot of things happening at the Johns Hopkins University at the moment. And I think you actually received, well, what was it, around 70 million in donations to actually start a psychedelic research center. So I'm really excited about all the things that might be happening in the next couple of years. And yeah, really looking forward to your talk. I think we have about 15, 20, actually 25, 30 minutes. So there will be some room for Q&A at the end. So please do ask your questions in the Q&A, and also please do upvote any questions that you would like to be answered at the end of the talk. And well, I'll give the word to Matt, and a really warm welcome. Looking forward.
Thank you, Erwin. It's a real honor to present once again at the ICPR. And as I was telling you before we were on air, ICPR, there's a lot of psychedelic meetings these days, and ICPR are the OGs, original gangsters in this area. So you guys have done quality work from the very beginning, and it just keeps getting better. So, thanks again for, asking me to, play some part in this. I very much appreciate it. So let's see. I'm going to go ahead and switch to showing you my screen. Let's see, host disabled participant screen sharing. So if you could, if someone could fix that, let me try it again. Host disabled participant screen sharing. So
yeah, sorry about that. I'll just
sure.
Yeah.
All right. So in the meantime, I have to tell you, since I'm not able to visit the Netherlands, which is always great, while this screen is getting fixed, I figured I'll tell an appropriate joke as an American who's disappointed to not be presenting this in person. So it's not auto.
Kan je me helpen? Ik kan die
Let's see, is it
sharing niet. Yeah.
Looks like it's still okay. Well, while you're working on that, continuing with the joke, it's not autobiographical, but I'll just put it out there. So here's the joke. It's a psychedelic joke. Why did the American tourist, when visiting Amsterdam, decide to purchase psilocybe sclerotia rather than purchasing psilocybe mushrooms? So again, why did the American tourist, when visiting Amsterdam, decided to purchase psilocybe sclerotia rather than psilocybe mushrooms? Well, the answer, of course, is that the sclerotia are permitted and the mushrooms are illegal. And the tourists didn't want to get into truffle. Okay, so sclerotia is a term for truffles. The beautiful thing about a virtual meeting is that I can tell the joke and I hear silence. So in my imagination, you're all just like rip roaring with laughter, rather than the more likely scenario where you're all just jeering me. And I'm not there in person, so there's no tomatoes being thrown at the stage. So let's see. I'll try to share the screen, and whoa, the screen is working. Thank you guys, and thanks for making time for that horrible joke in the meantime. And I have to say, I did see one of the initial comments from Keelan saying the beard is gone, and like, yes, it's one of the most minor victims of COVID. I will tell you that masks work a lot better without a crazy beard. That's for real. So I can verify that. So you should be seeing my screen right now. Someone, shout at me or something. If you're not seeing my screen, you should see a title screen that says Psychedelics as Behavior Change Agents. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And it's basically going to be an overview of some of our older work and at a very bird's eye view, going quickly through some of our findings, but then also showing you something new. And then I want to really focus on some big picture thoughts about integrating it all. What does it all mean for psychedelics and behavior change? By way of disclosure, I am an advisor to a number of companies developing psychedelics as medications. And so I'm showing those on the screen right now. And as Ervin mentioned, we are now, even though we've been doing research for nearly a couple of decades, and I've been involved with that since 2004, we're now a nominal center, which means we've gotten a certain amount of philanthropic donation where the university allows us to use that name. So thanks to the Cohen Foundation and the Tim Ferriss Collaborative. The center comes with a number of studies that have already initiated or we're working on initiating. And I'm the principal investigator of studies using psilocybin to examine opioid use disorder treatment and PTSD. Those are separate studies, and we have a number of other studies. Outside of the center funding, we've also received studies, funding for studies I'll lead using LSD in the treatment, high-dose LSD in the treatment of chronic pain. So, very much looking forward to, and also some work we're hoping to do, and it's not very COVID friendly, but we will be doing it at some point, is examination of holotropic breath work. I don't have time to go into them in detail, but just to acknowledge that there are absolutely risks. These are powerful tools, psilocybin and the other psychedelics, and they come with their own risks. We know a lot about what they are, and most importantly, we have ways to mitigate those strategies. So I would refer you to our 2008 publication, which recommended guidelines for research, and then also reviewing similar content in our 2018 publication I'm showing here, where we discuss this and also make recommendations for how the FDA and other regulatory bodies around the world, if these compounds are approved, what the appropriate regulatory standards should be, drawing from those guidelines. Our initial work in our group was looking at high-dose psilocybin effects in healthy normals. One of the biggest take-homes from the original research in a randomized blinded trial examining a high-dose psilocybin study was that we documented claims of improvements in mood and quality of life over a year after sessions, and those were also corroborated by friends, family members, coworkers, etc., of the participants in those studies. And the second study we did, also in healthy normals, was a dose effect study where we looked at 0, which is placebo, 5, 10, 20, and 30 milligrams body weight adjusted under double-blind conditions, and essentially found across a number of measures that increasing that psilocybin dose had a systematic effect on the likelihood of mystical experience, challenging experience, and long-term positive attribution. So I'm showing you one of our measures here, the percentage of participants rating it as amongst the 5 most spiritually significant of their life. So as you can see, although there's clearly a role for contact or set and setting, there's also clearly some pharmacology, because you see a beautiful dose-related relationship here. I mentioned mystical experience. It sounds a little woo-woo, but it is in fact a validated psychological construct dating back to William James, who was fascinated that these extraordinary human experiences outside of drug use shared remarkable similarities across the centuries, whether they, no matter what language or what part of the globe they were from. And remarkably, in those first 2 studies, similar to findings from the 1963 Good Friday study with psilocybin, we found that the majority of participants met criteria for a full so-called mystical experience, meeting all of these criteria, having a strong sense of unity, a noetic quality, a sense of sacredness, sense of transcending time and space, overriding positive mood, and ineffability. So it was claimed to be beyond words. And some of our subsequent work, both drawing from laboratory studies and from a large number of survey participants, thousands of them, using that, we developed MEQ30, which is the first measure specifically validated from an acute experience to validate this mystical experience construct. So the previous measures had sort of asked questions about a variety of experiences throughout one's lifetime. And so if you want to measure what kind of results from a session that you schedule next Tuesday, this is a great measure. And it could be used, by the way, for, meditation or other ways of inducing strong subjective experiences. Drawing across those first 2 studies, we also found an increase of personality openness, which refers to tolerance to other people's points of view, ability to hold a both and rather than either or framework, an appreciation for aesthetics. This is personality openness. The first time to our knowledge that any acute laboratory intervention has caused a personality change. And interestingly, it was not just getting psilocybin or the strength of the psilocybin. It was what drove the effect is whether the individual had a complete mystical experience defined by meeting all of those different categories. And the people that had a strong dose of psilocybin without meeting that those criteria showed no change on average. I'll move into the first of the 2 therapeutic studies. I'll tell you about the cancer distress study, picking up on older research with terminal cancer patients with LSD. These were, in our study, 51 patients. All had life-threatening cancer, not necessarily terminal, although some were considered terminal. About a third had a DSM disorder with depressed mood. About a third had one of the anxiety disorders, and a third had a combination of both. It was a within subjects design crossover. So in other words, everyone had both the real deal, a high dose psilocybin session, and a trivial dose, which is essentially intended to serve as a placebo and control for the instructional set and expectancy. So everyone after preparation had either the high dose, depending on the randomization, high dose or low dose, follow up in 5 weeks. Then they had the opposite of whatever they had before. So high dose had then the trivial dose, or vice versa. 5-week follow-up after that, and then a 6-month follow-up. Here, just showing you a subset of our gold standard measures, the Hamilton Depression and Anxiety Inventories. People came in at baseline in both groups at clinically severe levels of depression and anxiety in both groups, as you would expect before the randomization, before they differed. And then post 1 is 5 weeks after the first session. The people who have had the high dose at that point, we saw dramatic decreases into the area of the scale that suggests that they're not having they don't have a disorder. Substantial reduction into the normal range. Also a sizable reduction in the trivial dose group, probably due to placebo effect and also the strong rapport building, but nonetheless nowhere near the reduction in the high dose group. Post 2 is 5 weeks after that second session. Now, everyone's had the real deal high dose session, whether it was 5 or 10 weeks ago. And now you can see both groups on average are down to that very low level. And then remarkably, it's unchanged on average 6 months later. And the same story unfolds for depression and anxiety and other measures we've looked at. And interestingly, the subjective effect of mystical experience as measured at the end of the session day showed a statistically significant correlation to reductions in both depression and anxiety 6 months later. And this even held up as significant after controlling for just their ratings of how strong or intense the subjective effects were. So there's, again, second thing I'm showing you, suggesting there's something about the nature of the experience, not just having a strong drug effect. I won't go into details, but very similar results, both from a previous study that Charlie Grobe had published with about half the dose of psilocybin in cancer patients with depression and anxiety, and very similar results at about the same dose for the group at New York University with 29 patients and a slightly different design, a different control condition, but nonetheless, the statistical effects were extremely large, just like ours, suggesting this is a robust finding. It's not just happening in our hands. And of course, in an open label, non-randomized single group study outside of cancer, the Imperial College group showed large reductions in depressive symptoms in individuals with major depressive disorder. I'll tell you that our group has recently completed a randomized waitlist control study of outside of cancer people with major depressive disorder, and you'll have to wait for the detailed results, but we found similar effects in a randomized study, so very promising. I'll move into the smoking cessation work. Our pilot, previous research showing, suggesting LSD was useful for alcoholism and also some work with heroin addiction. We thought, okay, let's try smoking if there's this cross drug efficacy for addiction treatment. Of course, smoking kills more people than all the other drugs combined, legal or illegal. We don't control the headlines. Happy for the attention, but as hopefully you got from my review of the risks, we're not encouraging anyone to use these on their own. There are risks, but I definitely want to emphasize, holy cow, don't do this many mushrooms. That's a lot of mushrooms. They didn't clear this with us. These were real deal smokers, smoking on average 30 years, about a pack a day. These were not lightweights. We combined it with cognitive behavioral therapy. We had 3 sessions, moderate to high doses. The first dose was on the same day as their target quit date to quit smoking. This is one of our biological metrics of smoking, carbon monoxide. These are the results before psilocybin. This is after. You don't have to be a stats whiz to see we have a pre-post difference. In terms of point prevalence abstinence, that equated to 80% success abstinence at 6 months and 60% success at an average of 2.5 years. This is far and away larger than you typically see. In fact, on average, larger than has ever been reported in the scientific literature. It was an open label, so we can't determine causation. The question is this worthy of follow-up? And the answer is abso-freaking-lutely, because they're very promising, but we can't determine causation yet. The success rates were statistically related to mystical experience. So again, something about that experience. I don't have time to go into it, but we did a qualitative analysis. People said interesting things in this study about the sessions pointing towards interconnectedness, relief of withdrawal symptoms, increases in other things, but altruism and other positive effects besides smoking, insights into self-identity related to smoking. We're now mostly through, and this is the new stuff, a randomized trial comparing one psilocybin session, high-dose psilocybin session, to nicotine patch treatment, both with the same cognitive behavioral therapy. It's an 80-person study, 40 in each group. 44 people have gotten through the 12-month follow-up, and these are the current results. And if I were to have made them up beforehand, I would not make them up this good, because this is just, it's kind of unbelievable from a single psilocybin session. 59% success rate a year out with the psilocybin group compared to 27 with the patch, which by the way is like extremely good compared to the literature for rates with the patch at 1 year. So we're very proud of that, but it could change. So, the study's ongoing. So that's just where they are right now. We are finding so far with a subset analyzed so far of our participants, we're doing fMRI with some cognitive tasks before and then the day after, and then for some folks long term. And one of the things that's shaken out now is a task of cognitive control, where you have to override a prepotent or automatic response, sort of like the Stroop task, if you're familiar with that. And in that task, we found significant improvements with psilocybin, where people are essentially less susceptible to a distractor or interference trial. So we'll see if those results hold up, but it might indicate a mechanism psychologically in terms of increased cognitive control, or which might be related to increased mindfulness in the days after smoking cessation. It's not just smoking. Our good colleague Michael Bogenschutz at New York University now is finding similar results in a pilot study with alcohol use disorder. He's now moved on and I believe recently completed a randomized clinical trial. And so that's a promising line of research with a very similar trajectory. We've published several studies at this point on naturalistic stories of addiction recovery after a psychedelic, usually recreational, after psychedelic use, and with the results, claims of addiction recovery for smoking, for opioids, for cannabis, for cocaine, for methamphetamine. So I think that's all worthy of follow-up. So here, just got a couple of minutes, but want to talk about the big picture. What's going on here? How could, I don't think this is going to work for everything, but the data suggests it's working for a whole heck of a lot. You should be curious about snake oil effect. Is this going to hold up? I think if it does hold up, it points towards transdiagnostic common behavioral and mental mechanisms. And so I think of all of these disorders as addiction broadly defined, whether it's a substance or in depression, addiction to a certain way of thinking about yourself. These are the deep ruts that I think we're going to learn more about biologically and psychologically. And psychedelics have a way of blasting people out of that. And one way to put that is what in Michael Pollan's book, he credited me with this. It doesn't sound scientific at all, but I apparently said it's like a dope slap effect. People are dope slapped out of their story. Psychedelics open a window of mental flexibility in which people can let go of mental models to organize reality. And I guess the final thing I want to focus on here is, and I have this content in an editorial I published in 2018 called Psychiatry Might Need Some Psychedelic Therapy. I really think the way forward is viewing psychedelic therapy as quintessentially psychotherapy. Although it's clearly a medication, it's prompting a biological process. The way it works is by biologically prompting psychological reactions that we know are important for psychotherapy. So openness is one, cognitive flexibility, taking different psychological perspectives, getting out of your own self's way, different ways to put this, probably different mechanisms. And in a way, I think in the big picture, beyond just these therapeutics for the psychedelics themselves, an important thing is this bridge. Psychiatry has gone, particularly in the States, I believe, has really drifted off course from its roots. Psychiatry was originally, before we had all these medications, was about psychology. Psychology was at the heart of psychiatry. And now, unfortunately, it's become really, what pill do we prescribe? And so psychedelics, in a way, are very much in the middle, clearly biologically mediated, but I think more and more clearly indicating psychological processes. And that has to be what's accounting for long-term change, because the drug's out of your system very quickly. So if it opens up this window of flexibility, and that you reset a new normal during that flexibility, that is then what mediates the long-term change. And another final point, I believe, and another big picture point in this editorial, I'd encourage you to look into if interested. In the history of, psychedelics, we tend to think of this as just, oh, how unfair, this research was stopped after the late 60s, early 70s, and it was so promising, and this is sort of unlike anything that's happened in science. And I argue here that's not the case at all. If you look at Thomas Kuhn's description of how scientific paradigms, scientific revolutions happened, this is commonplace. Newton's Principia, it took 50 years for people to finally pay attention to that, the laws of motion. The same exact thing for Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. And there's plenty of other examples that Kuhn goes over. Here's a quote from Darwin. He says, basically, paraphrasing for brevity here, that essentially he's not expecting to convince the existing naturalist or, biologist of his time. He said a few naturalists endowed with a lot of flexibility, they might agree with me and they might be influenced by this book, Origin of Species. But I look with confidence to the future, to young and rising naturalists who will be able to view both sides of the question with impartiality. So it's not surprising at all that this research, started, had some excitement. There was a backlash, and it's taken a generation or two for us to finally dig in. And I think now was the time, and it's the newer generation that's going to really run with this. So we're not so different as a science from patterns within the history of science. So I've gone over a lot. I've surely forgotten people. That a whole lot of folks I'm showing on the screen have helped with the research I've briefly showed you here. So thank you to them. Thank you so much to the philanthropists that have supported this work over the years. And thank you for your attention. And if we have some time for questions, happy to do that.
All right, thank you, Matthew, for the amazing overview of all the work that you have been doing over the last, decades, I should say, I think. There are a couple of questions, and one of them, I think you also mentioned the importance of psychotherapy and really to really stress that is an important role in the therapeutic mechanisms of psychedelics. Somebody asked about the specific model of CBT you have been using in the smoking cessation study. So how did it look like, and how were people prepared, and how did they help to integrate the experience, for example?
We drew from different sources rather than one single source, but 90% of it falls into what would typically be called CBT. So some common components of that is like, don't just quit on the fly, assign it a target quit date several weeks ahead of time, prepare people for things like the withdrawal symptoms, talk about the positives and minuses of smoking. Like there's a reason they smoke, and let's not like deny that. And so I view that as very psychedelic, like get it all on the table, explore your mind and be honest with yourself. So the best of CBT, I think, can be psychedelic. And then things like prepare them for what to do if they do slip. Research has shown that it's critical that if you view yourself as a failure, if you don't prepare people for how to appropriately handle a slip, like if they do have a cigarette, then they'll do worse. But if they dwell into guilt, then that's a good recipe for just buying another pack of cigarettes and having full relapse. So things like that. So we also had some different things, like we included some guided imagery. We included some actually an oil, which you could consider CBT, but it's not typical CBT, but a scented oil that the idea was to become associated with our treatment. And then we encouraged them to use that if they had a craving for cigarettes. And we had them actually smell it during our psilocybin sessions as well.
Well, that's an amazing idea, I think, to connect those kind of smells to the really deep psychedelic experience, and to be able to use them when they have craving. That sounds really interesting as a hypothesis as well to explore further, I think. There are many other questions, but we only, I'm afraid, have one time for one more question. And one person asked about the abuse liability or the potential of abuse for psilocybin. Could you share a little bit more about that, maybe?
Most important thing is that there's no addiction that we know of. I'm careful as a scientist never to say never, but by all the available evidence, it certainly doesn't look like psilocybin has addiction liability. And by that, I mean compulsive drug use. We know that the way it works in the brain's reward center, more specifically, the way it doesn't work in the brain's reward center like other addictive drugs. We know that from the epidemiology, especially if you're careful to tease out ketamine and PCP and MDMA and other things. Here I'm talking about the classic psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD, mescaline, DMT, et cetera. And so we know this from animal models, whether they'll press a bar to get an injection. It usually looks more like a punisher than a reinforcer. So it doesn't have addiction liability, it appears, but it can be abused. And that just simply means used in a dangerous way. And there's plenty of examples that everyone will agree with. Like if you take a bunch of mushrooms and go for a drive in your car, that's abuse. It's putting yourself and others in danger. And then you get into more, subtle things like are you using in a pattern that's interfering with important priorities in your life, interfering with your family, your education, et cetera. So that would be it. So there is some abuse liability. And I would say it's impossible to have any powerful tool with no abuse liability. A knife can stab someone in an alley, or it can save someone's life by removing a tumor in surgery. So any powerful tool is going to have both sides.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really great analogy. All right. I'm afraid we have to stop. There are many more questions, but I think we could continue for a long time. But we have to stop this session now. But what we do suggest and recommend, there will be a community channel in WUFA where you can keep discussing the topics that came up, maybe answer more questions. And maybe, Matthew, will you be available there? Or I don't know about that, actually. Will you be
Right,
available
I'll
to?
jump into that
Yeah.
now and
Right.
hang out there a little while.
Great.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for this amazing first talk. And before we leave this call, in a couple of minutes, we have two different tracks starting. And one is about the multidisciplinary 5-MeO DMT research, and the other one is states of consciousness research. So look whatever track you want to follow, and I'm looking forward to see you all again. So thanks again, Matt. It was really great to have you here.
Thank you, Ervin.
All
Thank you,
right.
everybody.
See you.